people who would call themselves, who are pacifists. There is a subset of pacifists, and it certainly, as we'll talk about, it certainly does not include all pacifists, but includes a subset of them who I call pacifist aggressives. They not only have their own philosophy for what they do themselves and what they would urge other people to do, they would use the force of government to coerce everyone into following their moral standards. And they have succeeded in many places in the world. For example, in the United Kingdom or Australia, it is prohibited to own any arm for defensive purposes, not only a firearm, but even non-lethal defensive pepper spray is prohibited there, because in this view, self-defense is something that a citizen must never be allowed to do. This same view has long been promoted in the United States. For example, in the mid-1970s, the National Coalition to Ban Handguns was formed. The coalition, which now calls itself the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, since it has broadened its mission to banning more than just handguns. This coalition was originally created by the United Methodist Church General Board of Church and Society. And among the organizations that have been members of this pacifist, aggressive, coercively hopeful organization are quite a large number of religious groups, including American Jesuits, Unitarian Universalists, and many others. So is the use of force against another individual something that is religiously immoral? Well, that's what I set out to explore, the diverse historical and present perspectives on that in the book. So let's start close to the beginning with the Jewish Bible and the creation of the Jewish people. In Genesis chapter 14, we meet a guy named Abram the Hebrew. He was living elsewhere, and God told him to come over to what is modern-day Israel, and he did so. He was living there, and then some invaders from some kings from Mesopotamia came and kidnapped Abram's nephew Lot and lots of other people. So what Abram did was he armed his trained servants and set out to go find those kings who were escaping with their captives and their all the property they'd taken. And he led them in battle and defeated the Mesopotamian invaders. He took no booty or prizes of war for himself. He said, just pay me back for what my followers have eaten, and I'll let my allies, some other local kings, take whatever share they want. Immediately after that, Abram is blessed by the high priest Melchizedek, and then God appears to Abram, changes his name to Abraham, and promises that his descendants will be as numberless as the stars in the sky. And this is where the word Hebrew first appears in the Bible. So that's the guy who was found worthy to be the father of the Hebrew nation, and of course, the father ultimately of all the three great monotheistic religions that are called Abrahamic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Then there's a second subsequent creation or recreation of the Jewish people in the Bible, and that, of course, is the Exodus from Egypt. And in the Jewish Bible, this is the central defining event of history. It is their liberation from physical bondage and slavery, and it is also their beginning of liberation from spiritual and mental slavery, including slavery to an all-powerful state, as historian of philosophy Eric Voegelin writes about that they would no longer be living under the Pharaoh, they would be living under the rule of God. And so as the Hebrews are fleeing from slavery, and God had made the Egyptians favorably disposed to them so that the Egyptians gave them lots of possessions, God took the people toward the way of the wilderness to the Sea of Reeds, and the children of Israel were armed when they went up from Egypt. Now this distinction between being armed, which they were in the first moments of their freedom, and being unarmed, which they were not when they were slaves for 400 years in Egypt, has historically been a key distinction between the slave and the free person. This comes back to us in our own American history after the Civil War, when the defeated ex-Confederate states knew they'd lost the war, and they accepted that slavery as a formal institution was done for, and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States. But they attempted to keep the new freedmen, as they were called, in a state of de facto slavery, and so they enacted what were called black codes that put restrictions on the freedmen against, say, having public meetings without prior government approval, required them, instead of being free labor, to work or not work as they chose, when and on whom, with whatever conditions were mutually agreed. They had to sign labor contracts that would be unbreakable for at least 1 year. And also included in these attempt to recreate de facto servitude were arms prohibitions, either prohibiting arms outright to the freedmen, as Mississippi did, or requiring special licensing, as did states such as Florida. And it was to eradicate these black codes that Congress first passed the first Civil Rights Act of 1866, specifically calling out the constitutional right to bear arms as something that had to be protected in the former Confederate states, and then later the 14th Amendment, enacted with specific intent from voluminous congressional debate that, among other things, prohibited violations of the Bill of Rights and frequently mentioned the Second Amendment in anywhere by any state government in the United States or local government, and likewise empowered Congress through Article 5 to enact legislation to implement that. Well, the former slaves, eventually made it to the Promised Land, and on the way, God gave them a legal code, which has the Ten Commandments, of course, but had lots and lots of other details. One of them is in the 22nd book of Exodus, chapter 22. When a burglar is caught breaking in and is fatally beaten, there shall be no charge for manslaughter. And then it continues, but this doesn't apply if the sun be risen upon him. So the way this was interpreted universally in Jewish law by, for example, the scholars who contributed to the Talmud, which is a always evolving commentary and commentary on the commentary and continuing dialogue, is that the sun language was metaphorical. And what it meant was, if the burglar, whatever the time of day or night is not a violent physical threat to the people inside, then don't kill that guy. You can't do it. If you're sure, however the facts develop, that he's just like sneaking in and wants to run off with people's wallets, and when you confront him and say, "Stop taking my wallet, I'm going to rip the wallet out of your hand," he's not going to respond by attempting physical injury against the people in the home, then don't use deadly force. On the other hand, whether it's day or night, if there is a reasonable risk of violence by the home invader, then deadly force is permissible. And this is the same laws as ancient Rome had, as was reflected in what they called the 12 tables, which were literally 12 bronze tablets in the Forum that set down the fundamental laws. But Jewish law went further than just authorizing self-defense against the home invaders. It made defense of others into a positive legal command and duty. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 16. "Nor shall you stand idly by when your neighbor's life is at stake." And this, as was elaborated in the commentary, created a duty for any bystander, even a complete stranger, to come to the aid of someone who was the victim of an attempted rape or other atrocious crime. Now, the Hebrews, when they went out of Egypt, they certainly did need those arms, and pretty soon, because they got attacked by the Amalekites almost as soon as they got into the wilderness. And the rest of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, is replete with military history and stories of battles. And the consistent theme of these is sometimes the Hebrews win, sometimes they lose. Victory always depends on what God wants. And when the Hebrews are trusting and faithful, God will guarantee their victory. And sometimes it's in a very overt way, as in the early battles when Moses literally holds up his hands, and through that God's power is channeled and leads to victory in the battles. And other times, and later, it doesn't come in such an overt, miraculous way, but it's still always through God's power, one way or the other. And victory doesn't depend on numerical force or who has the best arms. It depends on that. And in fact, that's why the Hebrews often win battles when they are heavily outnumbered by a superior and more advanced civilization and a technologically superior foe. And they often use audacious tactics and bold counterattacks and things like that, or luring the other side into a valley, and then they sweep down into the valley and defeat the foe. Sometimes this is also done by individuals. There's the story of Judith, who, when there's a big army about to wipe out the Hebrews, she's a beautiful young woman. She goes off and for a visit to the other side's general, Scholasticism, and she's quite good looking, and she says, "Hey, mister, how about some fun?" And he thinks that's a great idea, and so they do that, and she helps him get drunker than he's ever been in his life. And when he's lying asleep dead drunk, she takes her sword out of her basket and slices off his head, puts it in the basket, walks out of the enemy camp, and then holds up Scholasticism's head, causing the opposing army to flee. We see it likewise in the book of Esther, which is what the holiday Purim is about, where Queen Esther, the Jews are at this point living in captivity in Babylon. Queen Esther won a beauty contest and is therefore got to be the Queen of Babylon. The king doesn't know she's Jewish, and the king gets inveigled by a wicked advisor named Haman to say, okay, how about we got to put out this order to kill all the Jews on a certain date. She screws up her courage, goes to the king and says, well, king, I'm Jewish too. And he's like, oh, well, that's a terrible idea. Haman, you bad guy. And so he has Haman hanged, but under the laws of the time, the king's order can't be rescinded. But the king says, hey, Jews, I know there's this order, but you guys fight for yourselves. And they do. And they defeat those who would wipe them out and kill them, thus making Purim one of the fitting the mold of all classic Jewish holidays, which are essentially of the theme, they tried to kill all of us. With God's help, we defeated them. Now let's eat. So we also see in the Bible the first arms control laws in history. There's a time when the Hebrews are living in their tribal confederation. They get conquered by some invaders. The Philistines, who probably came from Crete, tried to invade Egypt, didn't succeed in that, so they say, okay, well, where can we go next? And they come to where the Hebrews are living and do conquer them, partly because in the tribal confederation, the Hebrews are often disunited and have trouble coming together as one for national defense. And so the Philistines quite accurately recognize, well, we're not going to be able to keep these people under our thumb if they're armed. And so as the first book of Samuel says, now there was no smith found throughout the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. So no blacksmiths for the Hebrews, because then they would be able to make weapons. And so if you were a Hebrew at the time, if you needed your plow sharpened, you'd have to go to a Philistine smith. Well, the Hebrews do eventually fight a war of national liberation, led in part by King David, and their tribal confederation gets replaced by a monarchy, which God repeatedly tells them is a bad idea, but they say, no, we want a king, we want to be like other nations. And it seems to work out pretty well at first, but just as God warned, the monarchy creates a expensive and oppressive standing army, supports an ever more luxurious government with high and oppressive taxes, puts people into forced labor on behalf of the government, and it all works in a system with enrichment of the ruling elite at the expense of the people. King Solomon's son is Rehoboam, And his advisors say, the people are getting kind of restless, new King Rehoboam. Why don't you don't have to mean it, but why don't you say you're going to be nice? And King Rehoboam at least is admirably direct, and Rehoboam instead tells the people, my father made your yoke heavy, and I will add to your yoke. My father also chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. Which leads to a revolution in which the northern half of the Hebrew kingdom, which becomes known as Israel, throws off Rehoboam and establishes a separate monarchy. And this happens repeatedly as over subsequent centuries as various bad kings get overthrown by force. Now, there's also in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible lots of prophets, and some of these prophets have separate books of their own writings, and certainly very influential in thought always has been words that appear from the prophet Micah and nearly identically from the prophet Isaiah about the time when people will beat your swords into plowshares. And some people take this as a statement that therefore people who are following the Bible should beat their swords into plowshares and not have arms. But I would say in context, if you read what's going on in the discussion just before, it's talking about the end of days, when the Messiah will have come and there will have been enormous wars in which God lays waste to all of Israel's enemies, such as Syria and others, and there's tremendous devastation and what you would expect after a brutal war that essentially wipes out some enemy nations. And then at that point, that's when we beat plowshares into swords, and indeed, or swords into plowshares. And in fact, in this messianic future, the lion will lay down with the lamb, and everybody's going to be vegetarian, including the lion, which is a beautiful prophecy, but it's not a exhortation about how to do things in the present. And indeed, the other prophet, Joel, has the converse line: beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a warrior. And that line would in its own way be the story of Jewish history over the next 2,500 years. We commonly divide the ancient history from classical history with the time of Alexander the Great, his massive conquests. Well, after Alexander died, his enormous zone of conquest was divided into four of his generals, basically set up four different kingdoms, and including an area that controlled Israel. And Israel was originally under a kingdom based out of Egypt, which worked well enough, and everybody seemed to get along. But then it was the Seleucids, based in Syria, took over and were more coercive. The spirit of the time was, thanks to Alexander the Great, wow, Greek culture is spread all over, and people were thinking this is great, and people, including educated Hebrews, wanted to learn Hebrew. They translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. It was common to give children Greek names, and this Hellenization, the spread of Greek culture, was a very popular thing on its own, and people throughout the known world of Alexander flocked to it. But the rulers in Israel went further and started trying to impose it coercively, even though it was attractive enough on its own. It was getting plenty of Hebrews doing it, and attempted to wipe out Jewish religious practice, which then set off a revolution led by Judah the Maccabee and another national war of independence, which took about 20 years, but did result in Israel reestablishing itself as an independent government. And that of course, is what what Hanukkah celebrates. But the new Jewish dynasty, the Hasmoneans, had been pretty good in war, but were not so good in peace. They were as things worked out, also ruled the territories of two other people who actually believed in the same God they did, and everybody agreed it was all the same God, but they had different practices and were certainly not Orthodox Jews. And these were the Idumeans and the Sumerians. The Jewish rulers imposed forced conversion on them, and rather than creating a tolerant society, created one that was intolerant and accordingly divided, which made them easy prey for Roman conquest in the 1st century BC. The Jews never really accepted that. Tried some revolts, and from 66 to 73 AD, there was the Jewish revolt, which really set the Roman army back on its heels for several years. And then a second revolt from 132 to 135. And again, the problem was, besides fighting a anti-colonial, anti-imperial war, the Jews also were wasting too much energy fighting among themselves. And following the failure of the second revolt, we have the diaspora, where there are still some Jews left in traditional Israel, but most of them move out throughout the world, and thus live in a world of where there is no Jewish state, and none is established, except perhaps in Central Asia for a while. But in most of the world, there is no Jewish state until 1948. And living under these conditions, this is when Judaism becomes rabbinically led, rather than based on centralized temple worship, as had been the rule from King Solomon up to this point. And they say, look, whatever the thing is about, self-defense is fine. We got no problem. That's clearly morally legitimate. And yes, you can and so is overthrowing a bad government. But in practice, we are a minority every place, and we are much better off if we just go along to get along, because if we do anything else, we're going to get wiped out. And besides that, the diaspora is partly God's punishment for our disobedience, so just suck it up and live with it. As the saying goes, the law of the government is the law. And so accept how things are in whatever country you happen to be living in. And as the rabbis also said, and if you do that, then the Gentiles will not persecute you overly much. And this actually turned out to be often a successful formula, as in Poland in the late Middle Ages, as in some parts of the Muslim world. For example, the Jews living in Spain certainly welcomed the initial Muslim conquest of Spain, because the Christians there were being quite intolerant and were working to wipe them out. But obviously it didn't work everywhere all the time, and things got particularly bad among other places. And so when things got bad, Jews sometimes resorted to force. So, for example, the Jews had been allowed to move back into England under the Hanoverian kings in the George I and so forth from the 1700s. But there was not only social discrimination against them, it was pretty common for, if you see a Jew walking down the street, as well, we've got nothing else to do, let's go beat him up. And that begins to change in 1760 when the Jews take up boxing. In fact, Daniel Mendoza becomes one of the greatest boxers of all times and teaches his fellow Jews how to defend themselves. And as one commentator observed, once the Jews learned boxing, it was no longer safe to insult a Jew unless he was an old man or alone. And even then, once the Jews had started defending themselves, then if a crowd of nasty teenagers started bothering a Jew, other people would come around and protect the Jew and chase away the teenagers. That the willingness to defend oneself was a sign of self-respect, and accordingly brought the respect of other people. And this rose to a crisis level in the late 19th and early 20th century, when the pogroms in Russia became worse and worse, of mass violence incited or tolerated by the government against Jewish communities. And this comes at the time when Zionism is beginning, and what Irving Howe, the great socialist historian, described as the formation of the new Jewish character. That before, when you thought of a Jew, you thought of somebody who was disconnected from the body. A pale, skinny guy, stays at home reading the Talmud a lot. And what Zionism aimed to do is to reconnect Jews with their bodies, to be not feeble, but vigorous and capable of emulating the great heroes of the Bible, like Deborah and Gideon, very capable of martial skills. And then the whole thing intensifies quite a lot when we have the greatest example in history of mass shootings in gun-free zones. In the first year of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, June 1941 to the summer of 1942, the Germans immediately began mass murder of the Jews and also the gypsies, known as the Roma. And what they would do was they would send squads of what were called Einsatzgruppen into town and into villages, march all the Jews and gypsies out, and then machine gun them and kill them all, town by town. And they wiped out 1 million people that way. And the only reason they abandoned that tactic was it was too hard mentally on the Einsatzgruppen. So they first tried to have mobile killing vans, with a large truck with a gas chamber inside it, and that didn't work out so well. And it's only then when they moved to the mass industrial extermination camps, which required less contact between the killers and their victims. Well, when Jews were able to obtain arms, such as being able to make a pass key into a camp armory, they did revolt and fight back. And in fact, at the extermination camps of Sobibor and Treblinka were shut down and put out of business forever by Jewish revolts there. Now, very few people survived those revolts, but they weren't going to survive anyway, and they shut down those extermination camps. There are some kindergarten teachers who will tell you that violence never solves anything. But I will say putting an extermination camp out of business is a very good solution to what Hitler called the final solution. And there were revolts all over Europe. The most famous is the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, which Nazis. It began with only a few handguns, but one of the things in guerrilla warfare is you use a few guns to capture more guns and to capture more and more weapons. And it took the Nazis longer to suppress the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt than it had taken them to conquer Poland or France. But the best and most successful fighting was not in the cities, which were too concentrated, but when people could escape the ghettos and get out to the woods and swamps that were more plentiful in eastern Poland, Belarus, and Lithuania. Those who did survived at a higher rate than did people who did not fight. They saved many, many lives. Their critical shortage always was the shortage of arms because of gun control laws from the Polish dictatorship before, the Nazi regime, and of course the Tsarist and the communist regimes, all of which wanted a monopoly on force. But to cite just two examples, at Yanov, Ukraine, 12 armed men saved 120 people. The Bielski brothers, most famous and immortalized in movie Defiance, which I highly recommend, 149 armed fighters saved 1,140 people. And if more Jews had been armed, more lives would have been saved. As the principle of the Talmud puts it, if someone comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. The great mortality problem of the 20th century was not war, which killed many millions of people, but it was murder by government, which killed far more, 169 million from 1900 to 1990, according to University of Hawaii political scientist Rudolf Rummel. Every genocide we know of throughout history has been preceded by assiduous efforts to disarm the intended victims. Cambodia under the Pol Pot, the Soviet Union under Stalin, China under Mao, Rwanda, Darfur, Sudan, and to the extent that the victims are incompletely disarmed, many more of them survive, as in the Armenian genocide in Turkey during World War I. Obviously, not every people that are disarmed are then subjected to genocide, but every people that are subjected to genocide have been disarmed first. And for those who think that armed resistance can't make any difference and can't save any lives, all I can do is point to the practice of every genocidaire throughout known history is they thought differently and they wanted the victims disarmed before they were murdered. Now, so the question comes, well, does Christianity change all this? And Some people argue it does, and I will suggest that while I disagree with them, unlike in traditional Jewish thought, there has always been a part of Christianity that has favored pacifism. It has sometimes been more up or down within power and influence in the Christian world, but it's always been there, and it has, I think, historically over time established itself as at least a legitimate choice among Christians. But I would argue that it's not the better choice, and it certainly has not been the traditional choice. If Christianity were pacifist, then it is difficult to account for the New Testament, the number of Roman soldiers, who sure were not pacifists, who became well-respected Christian converts. This starts with the soldiers who were baptized by John the Baptist right at the beginning. In the book of Luke, there is the righteous centurion who was converted by Jesus himself, and the words that he speaks to them, he spoke, are repeated every day in the Roman Catholic Mass. Only say the word and my soul shall be healed. That's the guy who thought it up. And then later in the book of Acts, after the crucifixion and resurrection, we have the centurion Cornelius, the Roman proconsul, Sergius Paulus, and Paul's jailer, all of whom were military, part of the Roman military, and all of whom were converted into Christianity without the slightest hint that they had to give up soldiering. The apostles themselves carried illegal concealed arms. The law of the time forbade the Jews to have arms, and the penalty was death. And at the Last Supper, Jesus basically giving the apostles the instructions that, so far I've been looking out for you guys and taking care of you, but afterwards you're going to have to be more on your own and take some more responsibility for what to do and to take care of yourselves. And as part of this instruction, he says, "Let him who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one." To which the apostles, always eager beavers, immediately pull out two swords, and they say, "Lord, Lord, here are two swords." Apparently carried probably the gladius, a short Roman sword that they were carrying concealed since it was illegal. And Jesus, by the way, says that's enough, which has varying interpretations, but I think at least indicates that it's okay if you have a group of 11, not all of them have to have swords. Now, there are various proof texts in the New Testament which pacifists say, oh no, well, yeah, that's true, but I've got this one zinger which shows you have to be a pacifist. So, for example, when Jesus is arrested, Peter, lead apostle, pulls out his sword and slices off the ear of one of the Roman soldiers who's come to arrest Jesus. Jesus touches the ear, heals it, and tells Peter, put up thy sword into the sheath, which is the equivalent of saying, put your handgun back in its holster. And Jesus goes on to explain this is not the time for this. Things have to be fulfilled. And, I could call on God, I could pray to my Father, and he'd send down legions of angels who would get rid of these pesky soldiers in a second. But he doesn't do that because he knows what the plan is for the crucifixion. And so I don't think the best reading of that is to say you can never have arms, because if Jesus also could have gotten rid of the Romans by praying and chose not to, and that doesn't mean that there's a rule you can't pray. It meant in this particular situation we're not going to resist, but it didn't create a universal rule. And then, of course, there's turn the other cheek, but a slap on the cheek is a profound insult in the culture of the time, but it is not a deadly threat. And we know from the behavior of Christians in the post-biblical world, there were plenty who were in the army. We know of a few in the first century. Saint Fatoni, who's an Eastern Orthodox saint, killed in 64 AD. And by about 200 AD, as Christianity became more widely accepted, there were so many Christians in the army that at the Dara Europa military camp in Syria, they actually built a Christian church for the soldiers there. And of course, there were cycles of tolerance and persecution, but at least in the non-persecutory times, there were plenty of Christians in the army. Among the religious philosophers, what are called the fathers of the church, and other philosophers of the time, there were some who were clearly non-pacifists, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Julius Africanus, and there were some who were pacifists, Athenagoras and Cyprian, for example. And I think this shows that the Christian thought of the time was not monolithic, either before or after Constantine. Some people say, well, when Constantine took over and officially became a Christian and made Christianity a state religion, then the Christians went from being all pacifists to then being all non-pacifist. And it's not a night and day thing like that at all. There was diversity of thought both before and after Constantine. And some of the leading pacifists were heretics, notably Marcion and Tertullian, who rejected the physical world. And essentially, some of them were very much involved in Gnosticism. And a key point of that is that the book of Genesis, chapter 1, where God saw the world that he had just created, and he saw that it was good, that was wrong. And there's various theories. Either God was just mistaken and he wasn't really up to the job, or that this actually Old Testament God was a really bad guy, but there's a new God in the New Testament. But whatever it is, the pacifism awfully went along with rejection of the physical world. Augustine, the leading sort of summative Christian philosopher of this period in the early 400s, went back and forth on use of force. But the position he ultimately settled on is, yes, it is okay, but if you're really like trying to be Christian, and it's definitely a natural right to use force, but you shouldn't use it for self-defense, but you do have actually an obligation to use force, including deadly force, in defense of others, which would include a mother protecting her children, for example, a teacher protecting his or her students, and likewise service in a national army in the case of a just war. As we go through the Dark Ages, the political principle was based on chapter 13 of the book of Romans, that God put rulers into place for your good and for everybody else's, and you should just obey them. And so if the government acts tyrannically, which is to say acting for the benefit of the government rather than acting for the benefit of the people, then too bad. That's just, you should just accept that. But that view began to change in the 1100s. A key part of the change was a guy named John of Salisbury, who in 1159 wrote the bestseller of the century called Polycraticus. He was an English monk and was the first significant book of Western political thought in 600 years, where he explained that governments are put there for the good of the people, and when they stop fulfilling the good of the people, then the people have a right to overthrow the government by force if necessary. Similarly, Gratian of Bologna in 1140 collected all the disparate church laws that were found in various sources into a synthesized and unified treatise on canon laws. And he began it with explaining what natural law is. And he said natural law is across all civilizations, wherever you go, wherever you always find it the same, never regarded as unjust, but is held to be natural and equitable. And his explanation, so what's in natural law? Well, some of the things were the union of men and women, the succession and rearing of children, the identical liberty of all, the return of a thing deposited or money entrusted, and the repelling of violence by force. Later, Thomas Aquinas helped found what was called Scholasticism, which rejected the idea that faith and reason were just two separate spheres, and you shouldn't try to connect them. Rather, the scholastics tried to synthesize the Bible, faith, and reason, and this was one of the great intellectual advancements in all of human history. And Aquinas addressed the issue of using force for self-defense, because after all, there it says that, don't murder in the Bible. And Aquinas explained the principle of double effect, that when you are using deadly force in self-defense, you are not trying to kill the other person. Rather, you are trying to stop the crime. And I can tell you as a certified handgun instructor, that is what self-defense is. When you are shooting a gun at somebody who's coming at you and trying to kill you, you are not thinking, my objective is for this person to die. You were thinking, I want to deliver that fight-stopping hit. You want to incapacitate the person and take them out of the fight. What happens to that person later is not the issue. It is stopping the fight. And indeed, as a police officer, you'll often see, or a regular citizen, once that person is taken out of the fight and no longer a threat, then the first thing you do is, if you can, you summon medical aid. So Aquinas has the principle of double effect there in terms of self-defense. And likewise, the issue of sedition. Sedition is speaking against the government, trying to bring the government into disrepute, saying the government should be overthrown. And Aquinas says, is asked in his Summa Theologica, well, is sedition a sin? Yeah, sedition's a sin because it disorders society. But when the legitimate government instead becomes tyrannical, and instead of ruling for the benefit of the society, selfishly rules for itself and oppresses the people, then it is the government that is disordering society. The government itself is the one that is guilty of sedition and therefore can be removed by the people. These principles get advanced in what was called the Second Scholasticism in Spain's great period of riches in the 1500s and 1600s by Francisco de Vitoria, who, reasoning from the natural right of self-defense, explains why the Spaniards had no right to oppress the Mexican Indians there, regardless of the fact that the Mexican Indians, whether or not they were pagans, or even when they were presented with the gospel, they obstinately refused to accept it. Didn't matter. From the baseline natural premise of the right of self-defense, you have no right to oppress another people by conquest, but you do have a right to aid in wars of national liberation, which was part of how the Aztec Empire fell, because the other Indians in Mexico were sick of being used as human cattle for mass sacrifices and then cannibalism. Francisco Suarez, another great Spaniard, says the same thing about the right of self-defense and the right of resistance to tyranny. And these ideas get picked up by the Protestants. John Calvin, Theodore Zwingli, John Knox, and the anonymous author of a multi-edition bestseller, Vindication Against Tyrants. And they're all, Catholics and Protestants had a lot of pretty hard disputes at the time, but Protestant resistance theory is very much comes out of Catholic resistance theory applied, with the Protestants adding the prudential concern that the Catholics are much more open to the people just as the people revolting. The Protestant theory is it's a lot better if these are led by what we call intermediate magistrates, local governors, mayors, local councils, things like that. And indeed, that's what happened in the American Revolution, which was led by the 13 colonies as they worked in their civil capacity and adopting things. From this, we lead to the glorious Revolution of England in 1688, where these theories come to fruition. The political thought of John Locke and Algernon Sidney, their fullest fruition in the American Revolution, where the revolution is incited as a religious revival by what was called the Black Regiment, the New England Congregationalist ministers and their Presbyterian allies. King George ruefully remarked that the American Revolution was a Presbyterian rebellion. And a key point of this was that the moral degradation of living under tyranny makes it impossible in the long run to live as a Christian, because if you do that, you've always got to be sucking up to the guy above you and behaving with all the vices of luxurious living at court infect the entire society. And so you can only preserve the choice to be a practicing moral Christian, you can protect it far better if you live in a free and non-tyrannical society, which is why one of the key texts of the Revolution was from the New Testament: "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled in the yoke of bondage." Now, having said that, let me quickly talk about the best argument for pacifism, in my view, and that is the one presented by the Quakers, starting with George Fox in the 1600s in England. They had their biblical arguments, but they recognized that that for everything they could point to in the Bible, you could point to something else as a countertext. And as Fox said, Quakerism is experimental and not notional. And the fundamental Quaker principle was listen to your inner light. Start paying attention to that. Open yourself up to gradual discernment, and God will take care of it for you. And so there's a famous story of a guy who he'd been a military sailor, and he happened to be on some vessel with a Quaker, and they were bunkmates, and the Quaker didn't wag his finger and say, you got to stop being in the Navy and all this. He just spoke very gently to him and tried to say, well, just think about it and see how you think about it over time. And so Quaker pacifism was something that would be discerned by one's inner light over time as it came to people in various ways. And so when William Penn, who was an English aristocrat and became the top Quaker of his generation, goes to George Fox and says, well, George, I don't really want to fight anybody, but I'm an aristocrat, and the normal thing of aristocrats in England is we all carry a sword, and I just like having my sword because it's part of my uniform. To which Fox says, wear it as long as thee can bear it. By which Fox didn't mean, oh, you got to get rid of it because that's the rule. It's like, no, you'll come to a time when you paying attention to your inner light will decide you're not the kind of person who could ever carry a sword. And that's what happened with Penn, and he stopped carrying the sword. And so Quakerism at its best was highly tolerant of the consciences of Quakers, many of whom did not always agree with pacifism. The Quaker Blues were major fighters in the American Revolution and later in the Civil War. There were a huge amount of Quaker volunteers from states such as Indiana and Ohio, where they'd been highly involved in abolitionism before the war. And the Quakers, at their best, respected everyone's path to their inner light, which was the opposite of what some religious people try to do now, which is disrespect the conscience of others and say that, well, I've been personally convicted in my mind to be a pacifist, and therefore what I'm going to do is get the police, men with guns, to go and make everybody else be a pacifist and live according to my moral views. Thank you. The end. Yes, sir.
Richard Nixon, famously a Quaker, and yet he carried on the Vietnamese War.
Yes. So let me all.
Is that against his?
Well, certainly some people criticized him for that. There would be certainly some Quakers who, right from early American colonial days, who would say, yeah, we're, in Rhode Island, we're maybe being threatened by the Indians, or East Jersey. We Quakers, we're not going to have guns to defend ourselves necessarily, although some did. But they'd also say it's okay for the government to do this and to defend the states. So, for example, the constitutions of East Jersey of 1660, this is what we would today call southern New Jersey. A lot of Quakers there. They basically said mutual tolerance. We're not going to force Quakers to fight in the militia to defend the colony, and nor are we Quakers going to try to stop the colony from defending itself. So Nixon was consistent with that. Nixon also privately said guns are an abomination, and it was under his presidency when what we now have as the modern Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was created. And for all the ups and downs that Bureau has had, it was never more aggressive or lawless in how it treated gun owners than it was under Nixon. Yes, ma'am.
So you spend all of human history. How did you research this, the whole thing?
Oh, it was a long project, and something that's not in the book but is in a separate law review article is self-defense in Eastern religions, where if we get into Buddhism and Hinduism and Sikhism and else. Well, that's part of the fun of being a professor, or a scholar in general, is you can start digging into stuff, and it's sort of like if you follow the history of salt in the world, as one book does, or cod, you can just trace that one idea or that thing and find all kinds of fascinating things in history about it and how it's interacted. So the idea of self-defense in arms, you follow throughout human history, it leads to all kinds of stuff. certainly read many more Buddhist scriptures than I would have otherwise. It took a long time. Yes, sir, in the back.
Whenever I teach John Locke, there's that part of it about the French Revolution.
Yes.
It talks about that appeal to heaven.
Yes.
Seeing these flags with like
Right.
appeal to heaven on it. The students often think that what Locke means is you sort of ask God to come help you out. But given sort of light of your talk, it's interesting the merging of like the ideas of religion and self-defense.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if that phrase, the appeal to heaven, in your research, if you come up with like the source of that, if Locke come up with that on
Oh no, it's got a biblical, it's got an Old Testament evocation. I think like Jephthah or something like, thus making his appeal, he led the Hebrews out in battle. It also has a reminiscence of the medieval trial by combat, where instead of this lawsuit and all this kind of stuff, why don't we just send out one champion to fight for each of us, and God will grant the victory to who's right. And it was a hugely important thing, and it's one of the. Without that belief, the Americans would have never had the nerve to try a revolt against the greatest empire in the history of the world. And the British Army was quite good, and their Navy was spectacular. And these guys didn't even have a domestic gunpowder industry at the time. So it took a lot of guts, and that concept is still there very much in the American mind. It's one of the reasons the South ultimately crumbled at the end of the Civil War, is because they had both sides had gone into the Civil War thinking that God was on their side, and on the Confederate side as well. We keep losing all these battles, and Grant and Sheridan and these other guys are kicking us upside down. And that is not only bad as like, oh, it's too bad we're losing, but it destroyed the Southern morale in the sense of having confidence that God actually was on their side. And that's part of the reason why they ultimately collapsed, and part of the reason why there was, not an exclusive reason, but part of the reason why there was no like long-standing guerrilla resistance in the defeated Confederacy. Yes, sir.
Stand up and come over
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
So I carry regularly, and I'm also a Christian. But there's one part that the difference between martyrdom and self-defense, and I know that they're somewhat, very different in practice. One part of the New Testament, Philippians 1:21, I think, Paul is writing, and he's imprisoned, and he talks about, he says, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Meaning, even if the Romans kill me while I'm in prison, it's going to be a good thing because I go to heaven.
Yes.
Live, and it means I get to share more of that. Where do you think self-defense comes into play with martyrdom? An oppressive government or an oppressive system persecuting you because of your religion? Do you have a right to self-defense? Do you have a right, or should you have a duty to die?
I think it all depends. It's ultimately the individual's own life, and so it's ultimately up to the individual's own conscience. And there's no question that in Christian thinking, martyrdom is an extremely glorious thing. There's also lots of writings is like, don't go seeking it out. You don't have to go look for it. And if the Roman army or the persecuting side in the Protestant versus Catholic wars is coming after you, and you're hightailing it out of town, it's okay for you to run as fast as you can. You don't have to be like Jesus and say, here I am, go kill me and have at it. The trying to escape is perfectly fine. And certainly, lots of soldiers have looked at it, have said you do both. I mean, if I'm going to go fight to stop the Nazis, and this is my duty to act and stop this mass murder and tyranny. And if I happen to die on the way, well, that's martyrdom for you. So it's not necessarily either or, but it's never something you should. Of all the decisions, that should not be imposed by anyone on anyone else. That would have to rank pretty high. Let me see if the
last question.
Yes, sir.
Oh,
And anybody else? We got one more, or we'll go for a second round here.
okay. The Zionists, do they reconcile the death of the British soldiers when they blew up the hotel in 1947? Did you
Yeah. Oh, sure.
find
No, but-
anything about that?
Oh yeah, no, and there's lots of and the book gets into the history of modern Israel. But I thought some of you might want to go before midnight, so there were many parts of the book I left out. In my view, any legitimate war of if you have a legitimate war of national liberation, obviously you're going to be fighting with the other side, and you are, if you're fighting according to the principles of just war, which have Old Testament roots and then get worked out in more detail in starting with under Roman law with Cicero, and then further refined by Augustine, and then more by Aquinas, and then thereafter. You may not be able to avoid civilian casualties entirely, but you don't seek out civilian casualties, and that is a key distinction. In Israel's war of national liberation against British colonialism, one group bombed a hotel, the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which had a lot of British diplomats in it. There are disputed versions about how that happened. They would say, we warned them and tried to get everybody out, but it didn't work. Other people would say, no, you knowingly killed a bunch of British diplomats, and if the latter were the case, then that would be a violation of the principles of just war.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Before we give him one last round of applause, I just want to invite you to enjoy more food before you leave. It's all there. Please eat up. Thank you again for coming, and let's please give a round of applause.
Thank you.